Hey guys, so by far the question that I get asked the most, on my YouTube channel, on Twitter, or even streaming on Twitch, is how did I learn Japanese? And if I had any tips to help beginners have an easier time, I guess sort of overcoming that initial obstacle or initial hurdle that quite honestly any language is going to have when you first start learning it. But this is a video that's been honestly over a year or so in the making. But I'm finally going to tackle this question. And before we get into things, there are three sort of points or topics that I want to clarify first. Number one, there are absolutely no shortcuts if you truly want to go from a position of knowing essentially nothing to being relatively competent. So if you're somebody who clicked on this video looking for some kind of shortcut or cheat code, or some way to learn extra fast or skip steps or something like that, then unfortunately this is just not going to be the video for you. Number two, I myself am a native English speaker who grew up in the United States, so my experience and everything that I'm going to be discussing in this video is based on my personal experience and background as somebody who grew up speaking English only and was only familiar with the grammatical rules and nuances of the English language. And number three, I am not going to be teaching you Japanese in this video directly. The purpose of this video is to explain to a beginner in the very early stages of learning the language, or even before they jump into learning the language at all, the game plan, things you should be looking out for as you first set out on this journey to learning Japanese, recommendations that I have in order to spend your time more effectively learning the language, and things of that nature. The title of this video, as you see, is How to Learn Japanese, not, Japanese Lesson 1. So as I mentioned earlier, I am a native English speaker, and it wasn't until I got to junior high school that I really started learning Japanese. And I was pretty fortunate, obviously, that my school actually offered the language. But at that point, it was something that I just sort of took for fun with my friends. We sort of just like, okay, yeah, this would be fun to do. And we didn't really take it too seriously at that point. It's been including me. So I did have a few quote-unquote formal years of training in the language, but it wasn't until I first traveled to Japan myself that really opened up my mind and my eyes to what the language really was, and then the culture as well. It was also part of it, and that's really what drove me to actually take it more seriously and be more devoted to actually learning the language, and become a more serious student of learning Japanese. Another factor that really motivated me was also the fact that when I went over to Japan for the first time, I realized that I actually didn't know anything, or I know very little about how to speak and interact with people there. And so that sense of weakness that I had, and that I couldn't communicate as well as I wanted to, it really did motivate me to try and learn more as soon as I got back to the US. And that sort of drove me to become better at the language, and it just made me more studious, I think, at the end of the day. So what I'm getting at here is that before you even begin to make the decision to dive into the language, or anything, to be honest, because it's such a long process that can be quite challenging, it's really important to find something that is able to motivate you to keep pushing yourself to actually learn the language, because again, this is a process that you can't really skip steps for, and it's going to be a long road, and depending on how fluent you want to be, it's going to take years and years of trial and error of figuring out what works for you and what doesn't. So from that point forward, after my first experience in visiting Japan, the way that I continued learning the language changed drastically, and I went from somebody that typically had more of a formally trained background in the language to somebody who was mostly, if not all of my learning, done through talking and speaking and messaging people. And so from that point forward, I continued taking classes in college, but even with that in the picture, by far the main source of my learning and growth in the Japanese language came from the time that I spent both speaking and messaging people directly. And so I think that because I have a breadth of experience with different mediums in terms of techniques and ways of learning the language, I can give some valuable insight into some things that have worked well for me, some things that really didn't work so well for me, and just keep in mind that obviously everyone is different, so some things that I talk about in this video that maybe did work for me might not work for you, and vice versa. Whenever somebody asks me what the number one thing is that I would recommend to help them when beginning to learn the language, I always say that if possible, you should look into either taking a class that doesn't have to be like a formal in-person class. It can be online through an app, whatever, or hiring a tutor for like 2 to 3 sessions or something like that. The reason why this is always my first recommendation to people is because it's vitally important for you to understand why exactly Japanese Japanese is different from your native language. And if you're somebody who prefers to study on your own and teach yourself everything, it's going to be extremely, extremely hard for you to overcome that initial learning curve where literally everything is, completely different essentially from your native language. And that's something that a class or a tutor can really, really help you with. For example, how different is the ordinary sentence structure? How are verbs handled and how do you conjugate them? How do you typically start a sentence and how do you typically end a sentence in a natural way to progress from one, saying to another? What differences come about from speaking formally versus informally? These are just some of the questions that you have to ask yourself as well as compare to your native language in terms of the differences between your language and Japanese, because all of those things are vitally important to learning Japanese. And I would bet that most of those ways that you talk and, nuances that you have in your own language are going to be fundamentally different than your own native language.
Oh my god! Even though oh my god!
So as I don't want this video to go on, drag on forever, I'm only going to be covering some of the basic elements of what you should begin to learn in order to start off on the right track. First, we have hiragana and katakana. These are essentially the two different alphabets that exist in the Japanese language, and I would say that most, if not all, Japanese instructors / classes begin by teaching you these things. And if I was to equate this to English, I would just basically say, before you can learn to read and write, you have to learn the alphabet. That's the basic way of progressing from step A to step B. Hiragana is the alphabet that is used for denoting words that are of Japanese origin, whereas the katakana alphabet is, more often than not, used to denote words that are foreign in origin, such as words that are borrowed from another language. For example, the word ball can be written in Japanese like this, which reads boru. So because this word was essentially taken from English, it's pronounced almost identically, and in this case would be written using katakana. Next we have kanji. Now kanji is one of, if not the most difficult parts of learning Japanese. So it might be a little bit puzzling as to why I'm bringing this up as one of the important parts of learning the Japanese language as a beginner. Well, unlike hiragana and katakana that can be classified as pretty much the two alphabets of Japanese, there are literally thousands and thousands of kanji, each with their own distinct meaning. The important thing to do as a newcomer to the language is not to sit down and memorize every single kanji that exists, but rather to understand the concept behind the system and to take it step by step, starting with kanji that are much more common and easy to understand. The main difference between hiragana and katakana as compared to kanji is that because we equated hiragana and katakana to the English alphabet, we need to use multiple hiragana and katakana characters to form a word that means something. On the other hand, each individual kanji character has its own meaning, and you can combine different kanji to create words that have completely different meanings. For example, the kanji for flower, hana, when combined with the kanji for fire, hi or bi, means fireworks. The last specific concept that I want to touch on are particles. Now, this is something that I personally had a lot of trouble grasping when I first started learning the language, and it's not really something that we see too often in the English language with the exception of a few cases. Basically, particles are a way to structure and organize your sentence so that the person you're speaking to can more easily decipher what you're trying to say. There are particles to identify the topic of the sentence as well as the direct object, the subject, and so forth. I can't really go into exceptional detail discussing particles here in this video because, it's a pretty difficult topic to explain and, it's just not practical, but I can give one example. The sentence that we have here means I like dogs. Watashi wa inu ga suki desu. Now let's break down this sentence a little bit. Watashi is I, inu is dog or dogs, as there's actually no way to differentiate between a singular dog or many dogs, and suki desu is to like something. So technically, based upon the meanings that I just explained to you, if you were directly translating from English, you would think that you would just say, Watashi inu suki desu. But to a native Japanese speaker, that sentence wouldn't make any sense at all because it's missing the particles. So we have two particles in this sentence, wa and ga. Wa and ga are actually two particles that have a relatively similar meaning, but in this case, wa functions to mark the topic of the sentence, whereas ga marks the subject of the sentence. In this case, the word coming before wa would mean the topic of the sentence, so I. And the word coming before ga would be the subject, or dogs. As I said before, this is a rather difficult concept to grasp for beginners of the language, but if you dedicate yourself to learning how particles work, it will make your lives much, much easier, especially when you start getting into much harder material. It's going to be a lifesaver if you're able to understand exactly how they interact with sentences and structure and organize things. Lastly, I want to outline some resources that you can use to supplement your studies. There are a series of textbooks called Genki, Genki, that I know a lot of students are using these days to help them learn the basics. Any good textbook should be able to guide you through the learning process without there needing to be an instructor there to hold your hand if you're dedicated enough. I think just a textbook should be sufficient to set you on the right track at least. There is an extremely handy app that I've been using for well over 7 years at this point, which is just called Japanese. So it's very easy to remember, but it is a free to download app available on the App Store, and I believe it should also be available on the Play Store. I'll put a picture of the app somewhere on the screen so you can have a reference in knowing what I'm talking about here, but it's a very, very useful app. This app won't specifically teach you anything in particular outright, but it's essentially the best encyclopedia / dictionary I've ever seen for the Japanese language, and it even lets you handwrite characters on the screen to identify what you're trying to search. I just want to briefly discuss anime because I know a lot of people get interested in learning Japanese largely due to being into anime. And something that I would say to do is to have Japanese subtitles on if possible when watching anime, and then use the Japanese app that I just talked about before to look up any words that you aren't sure of or that you don't know the meaning to. I found that having some sort of memorable history with words or vocabulary that you're learning often helps you remember it much easier. So if you're interested in some anime or Japanese show, even maybe some drama stuff, try and find a way to turn on the Japanese subtitles and look up words that you don't understand. I feel like that's a good way to sort of connect your interests, your personal interests, with words that you could, find handy to use in the future in your studies. So just to recap what I believe to be the best way to start learning the language, I think the hiragana and katakana alphabets are things that you can, at the end of the day, teach yourself before even taking the first steps of learning the language in any formal capacity. And then once you've gotten those down and memorized, I would recommend taking 2 to 3 classes or tutoring sessions just to get a feel for what it means to actually learn the language in order to understand what makes it fundamentally different from your native language. The only thing I will add, though, is if you're somebody who wants to go down that textbook route and you're keen on teaching yourself everything, you're really missing out a lot in terms of the practice portion of the language, because at the end of the day, languages are meant to be spoken with other people. So at some point, try and find somebody else to speak with, because it's really going to help you understand in what areas you need to improve on, as well as things that you maybe aren't super strong with in terms of, listening is also a skill that you need to be aware of as well. And that's something that's very difficult to grasp just, with textbook learning or formal, any sort of formal training. After that, it's really up to you in terms of how you want to proceed. If you can find a partner to constantly speak and message with, to me, that is probably the ideal way to improve the quickest. But if you can find a textbook that you really like and you think you're comfortable with proceeding that way, that's also a great way to improve your knowledge as well. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you guys decide to go down this path and learning Japanese, I wish you the best of luck possible, and I will see you all in the next one.